So this is my 2014 Can-Am Outlander Max. And what I have here is an interface board. Plugs in between the stock ECU and the harness. This board is designed to run the Speeduino firmware. Right now, using a Teensy 3.5. I may change that later. The Teensy 3.5 is way overkill. I used it this time mainly because it was smaller than trying to figure out where to put an entire Mega 2650 or 2560, excuse me. It's got a little place on there for a Bluetooth module if I decide to put it on, and there's some unpopulated power supply stuff. I wanted to see if at first I could just run off the 5-volt VREF coming from the computer, and that appears to be working just fine, so I may leave it that way for simplicity's sake. This board basically loops the bulk of the wires through, and as you can see, most of the wires in that 48-pin connector are populated, so this ended up being quite a bit more wiring than I was planning on having to do, and I think I might kind of redesign this whole thing where I'm not having to do quite as much wiring and just go to the injectors and the coil and the individual sensors rather than make this huge big thing, because it does fit up in there in its current state, even though this is probably not ever going to end up on a machine other than just for testing. Right over here you can see the jumpers, and what these allow me to do is go back and forth between the factory ECU control of the injectors and the coils, or having Speeduino hardware take over it. Right now I've just got some solder blobs on there. That ended up being pretty handy. I thought about putting some toggle switches in there, but for now I'm just trying to get it set up and see if it's reading. So I'm going to do one-handed here. Oh, also the reason this is kind of two different boards was for two different reasons. With just having the control signals come up to this upper board, that frees me up for putting in kind of any controller I want to on it. I mean, all the hardware and the analog stuff is here. I've got some op amps and the divider resistors and whatnot. And my thought was, if I do decide to go ahead and build a 5-volt board using the Mega, I can just remove some of the pull down or the voltage divider resistors. That way I'll still be going through an op amp, so I won't be pulling any current off the stock ECCU. Won't be interfering with those signals too much, or minimally at least. So that just kind of pops onto there. Apologize for the audio and the shaky camera. And set that aside for now. I got that board done up at JLB PCB. They do a really good job. So this, like I said, this is just a pass-through. Different colors of wires there are just mainly because there's a lot of low signal stuff. So I've got 20 gauge wire on that, and then the pink wires are the higher current 18 gauge stuff. Also on this board, I got a little fancy with the grounding scheme. I did keep the high current stuff for like the coil drivers and the injectors completely separate from the analog stuff. It looks like that's, as near as I can tell from the wiring diagram I've got for this machine, that's kind of how the factory did it too. But I did include some jumpers to tie them together if need be. So at this point, my plan is, if I decide to stay with this route of interface, just piggyback it on top of the factory wiring harness, my initial thought was this would sit about here, and I think it will. I might have to shrink things down a little bit and obviously get some kind of a case, or maybe just pot the entire thing. But it would need to kind of stay up here higher, because the one thing I've noticed just now doing some testing is that this exhaust obviously does get hot. And just sitting here, I'm not too comfortable with the heat that I'm seeing even now just coming up, even though it seems to be fine for the factory ECU. So I have, sorry about that camera work there, guys. So we're just connect up to it and we'll plug it into the computer, and I'll just show you that I do have some of my signals coming through. There's my tuner studio. If I turn the key on, there. Oh, that glare is terrible. So I've got throttle position. I've got coolant temp. This thing's been running for a while, and I believe I just used a GM coolant temp sensor, and that appears to be pretty close as near as I can tell. I'll do some more testing on that just to make sure, but it's close enough for now. The air temp sensor, on the other hand, is a whole nother animal. It was pegging the gauge out and reading 416, so it's obviously not the same thermistor type. And that doesn't surprise me, because on this particular machine, the air temp sensor is integrated into the manifold air pressure sensor. Speaking of which, that's my manifold air pressure. You'll notice it's only reading about, what is that, 82? I'm at roughly 4,500 feet, maybe 4,700 feet. That's about correct. I've never seen a map sensor calibrated correctly at this altitude, at least, that read anywhere near 100. They were always down around 82 to 84. So I think that's probably going to be close enough. And on the trigger, it took me a little bit to figure out. I ended up setting this up for a Harley-Davidson 36 -2 -2 -2 trigger. And the reason I had a little trouble figuring that out, and I'm still not 100% sure it's right, but I think it just about has to be, it's all under this cover here. I would have to do quite a bit of disassembly to even get a look at that. And the plan was to just hook it up and use the tooth logger to figure it out. However, can't seem to get the tooth logger to work, even though I upgraded to Mega Squirt. But so far it seems to work just fine on that. Right now, the only thing that I need to work on, I think, is going to be that air temp. But I'm just going to start it up here. It's my Tuner Studio RPM. There's what that reports. Pretty close. If I rev it up here. It's pretty close. So it looks like, at least for now, though I don't have control over anything yet, I will at least be able to do some data logging. I do have a little wideband air fuel controller hooked up in the exhaust. I don't have it hooked up to my little Speeduino interface board here yet. I did, I don't know if you can see it right in there. That is where I can just plug directly in power and read the Speeduino, the wideband air fuel directly into the Speeduino. And my initial plan, I think I'm just going to try to do some logging with it. I don't think this is something I'm going to take up out into the boonies quite yet. This is just a little too hinky. This was mainly done just for testing purposes. So, but so far it seems to be pretty good. See there, you can see the inlet temp is not quite right. I think what I'll just end up doing is pulling that off, sticking it in the freezer, getting a measurement, and then getting it warm and just building a custom file for it. However, coolant temp is reading about 160, and I think that's fairly accurate. I don't have any way of, at the moment I don't have any way of verifying that, but it seems to, it'll get up there around 170 or so and the fan will kick on, so it's close enough for now. I might have to do some tweaking on that, but, oh, yep, there's my battery voltage. I'll need to double check that. Anyway, this video is just about 10 minutes now, so I think I'll wind it up. There's not a whole lot more to say, but I thought I'd just put this up on YouTube and show you guys kind of what I'm working on. Thanks.